the flagship program in this state, right? And
a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit.
Happy Hump Day, everybody, and welcome in to another late night edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, otherwise known as Dit Hole, your favorite source for college sports. My name is Michael Ween, coming to you live from Houston, Texas, Wednesday, May 22nd, 10:15 p.m. in the immediate aftermath of Game 1 of the Western Conference Finals, a game in which the Dallas Mavericks came back and stole Game 1 in Minnesota, and my co-host is excited, to say the least. Some could say aroused. Let's go ahead and get into this thing. We got a loaded show for you guys tonight. We're going to talk recruiting. The recruiting cycle for 2025 for the Longhorns is officially starting to really gas up. All gas, no brakes is what we like to say if you are a fan of the burnt orange. We have an interesting article from The Athletic that was published last week on the 2025 potential draftees at quarterback. And there were some interesting comments made about one Quinn Ewers. We'll get into that. And then finally, we're going to talk some Texas baseball. Conference tournaments are this week. And the NCAA tournament bracket with all the regionals will come out Memorial Day. That'll be Monday around noon is when all the regionals will be set. Those will start next Friday. So in 9 days, Texas will be playing its first official postseason game for the school year of 2023-2024. But with all that being said, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. We greatly appreciate that. And let me welcome in my very excited co-host tonight, Mr. Emmy Nixon.
So, man, I am fucking beaming right now. Holy crap. Sorry for the language, but man, I am hyped up. I'm ready to go for this pod, man. That article you mentioned on The Athletic, there's a interesting conversation there. I'm excited to get into that because I feel like there are some, criticisms of Quinn that we haven't really gotten to on this show a lot. So I'm excited to get into that.
Yeah, so we'll start there because it's been a hot topic in the world of Texas Longhorn football. There was an article done last Thursday by Bruce Feldman, who is a very well-respected writer, college football writer for The Athletic. And it's a great article. I love these kinds of articles where they go and they interview anonymous coaches or anonymous scouts about certain players or certain teams. They do this all the time at The Athletic. It's one of the better things I think they do because you get insight from the people that actually, are coaching and scouting, the people in the profession. And this article, you can go read it if you have a subscription to The Athletic or the New York Times, I believe. They basically interviewed coaches who maybe played against these quarterbacks or know about these quarterbacks, and they asked them questions about these quarterbacks that will potentially be eligible for next year's draft or will be drafted in next year's draft. And so, you've got Carson Beck, you've got Jalen Milroe, you've got Quinn Ewers, you've got
Shedeur Sanders,
Riley Leonard, Shedeur Sanders. The list goes on and on. Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, Cam Ward, who we've talked about at Miami. It's a pretty, lengthy article. And you guys should go read it if you have time because it's a lot of great insight. But the second quarterback in the article is Quinn Ewers, the quarterback at Texas. Third year, going into his third year. There are high expectations. He's co-favorites with Carson Beck as of right now in Vegas to win the Heisman. And there are expectations that he elevates to another level this year and becomes potentially a first-round pick. And that will coincide with a lot of success for the Texas football team in the first year that they're in the SEC. By the way, we're getting really close to the point where Texas is actually in the SEC. That will happen officially July 1st. So we've got just over a little month to go. We've been talking about it now for pretty much 2-3 years, how this move was going to be made, and it's almost finally here. But not to get us sidetracked, we're going to go through each quote. Actually, would you rather read all the quotes and then have a discussion, or go through each quote and talk about whether or not you think the quotes were fair, not fair, and just
I think the latter probably.
Okay.
Each quote.
Okay. So, to give you guys some context, these quotes, if you're a Texas fan, they got a lot of Texas fans fired up, and they're not necessarily the quotes you might expect to hear about a quarterback that right now is said to be favorite or co-favorite for the Heisman Trophy going into next season on a team that's going to be ranked in the top 5 going into the season. But here they are. The first coach that they asked a question to was a DB coach who played Texas this past year. And he starts out by saying, quote, "I'm not that high on him," end quote. And he goes on to say, "Overhyped, he has a good arm, and he did have a lot of talent around him, but you just see a bunch of stuff where you wonder what he's doing out there." So that's the first quote. Again, that's a DB coach who played Texas last year. Emmy, your initial reaction to that?
Well, I do think there's some truth to the turnover worthy plays and stuff like of that nature, but the thing that I think is kind of getting thrown under the rug here with comments like this is just that we've seen this guy improve year over year, going from 58% as a passer to 69%. That's not a coincidental jump. Like, he had a legitimate jump as in terms of accuracy as a passer. So do I think there's another level to reach in terms of consistency with his decision making and just consistency just as a passer in general? Of course. But I don't think that eliminates him from being, seen as a possible first round talent.
Yeah, so I think here, the first part of the quote from his perspective is fair. If you're not that high on him, you're not that high on him.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll prove you wrong this upcoming year. He still has a chance absolutely to do that. Overhyped, I think that goes a little too far. Keep it right there.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that goes a little too far. What I will say about that is I do not think that Quinn Ewers has lived up necessarily to his recruiting ranking, which coming out of the 2022 class when he committed to Texas, then decommitted and went to Ohio State and redshirted. I do think being the number 1 overall player in the country and having that 5-star ranking, he hasn't quite lived up to that yet.
Yeah.
Because what that ranking really signifies is we think this guy is going to potentially be like the number 1 pick in the draft. That's what 5-star is. They give out 5 stars to guys that they think have first round NFL draft potential coming out of high school based on their tools and everything else. Overhyped, I mean, it depends how much hype you heard about him coming out, but there was a lot of hype. You had the hair and the strong arm, the ability to make throws from everywhere. He has the same trainer as Patrick Mahomes, so that he was drawing comparisons to Patrick Mahomes, which were probably a little bit unfair at the time to him, but probably some of his own doing because they share the same trainer, and he kind of brought it up. So that's that, right? I don't get too bothered by that.
Yeah.
He has a good arm. That's true. I would even venture to say he has a little better than good of an arm. I think he has a really good arm, great arm, maybe you could say. And he did have a lot of talent around him. Yes, absolutely, he did. But the last part of the quote is kind of what I don't want to say bothers me, but I think it's a little unfair. You just see a bunch of stuff where you wonder what he's doing out there. It makes it seem like, to me, that this is a quarterback that's just clueless some of the time. And look, Quinn's had moments where, look, he's made some bad decisions. He's had quarters, games even, where he hasn't played well. But to say he doesn't know what he's doing out there for a guy that only threw, 6 interceptions, completed 69% of his passes, and ran for, I think, 4 or 5 more touchdowns. I don't know. I just feel like that's going a little bit too far. But a lot of what is said in this first quote is absolutely, I think, fair.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, I think you can kind of put the OU game kind of in its own category as like he played really well in that game. And I think you can kind of see what he's talking about in maybe like a game like, say, the Houston game, where in the fourth quarter things kind of, hit the brakes offensively, really, and they kind of just skirted out of that game. And that's not all on him. Obviously, there's offensive execution stuff that plays into that. But to me, the big thing with Quinn is like everything that has been, has gone well with the offense, it feels like, has been, perfectly drawn up by Sark, and he's really good at executing that stuff. But to me, I'd like to see him be able to create. And that's something we've talked about before, and that's something they've put an emphasis on, and he's talked about as well. So I think that's the next step. And I think that's kind of what's being referred to here a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the next quote. So the second quote in the article is, quote, "I think he's just still trying to figure things out," end quote. That part, totally fair to say, right? And this was a veteran Big 12 assistant. They don't clarify what position he actually held, but just a veteran Big 12 assistant. Quote, and this is what you mentioned, "Sark does a good job of setting things up for him." Absolutely fair. "And you'll see times where he'll rip it." Also completely fair. But then there's other times he just seems to be a little timid.
I agree with that.
The quote here that was worrisome if you're Quinn. If you're looking at this from Quinn's perspective. Quarterbacks don't want to be associated with that word at the end, timid. But there is a line to be drawn between, not being timid, but also not being over aggressive.
Yeah, reckless.
I do think some of it may be from Quinn's perspective, given that he has an injury history.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that might play a part of it, but you'd absolutely like to see him do a little more. I do think there was an effort last year to kind of take better care of the ball, ensure that he was doing his job, driving the bus in this offense, a very complicated offense. And you saw a lot more checkdowns than you probably like to for a guy that, is expected to go out there and be great and be a first round pick. And with all the weapons that he had around him, you'd absolutely like him to be more aggressive at times and take more chances. But the only thing I'd say there is just, and I'm sure the coaches know this, there's a line that has to be drawn. And, we don't know what's being said behind the scenes, from Sark to Quinn. We think we know, we can guess, but you never know what Sark is actually telling him. So it's a totally fair quote. I would just make sure there's some context added there.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add on that?
I think that's all I wanted to say. I think the part about him ripping it and kind of, throwing that fastball and using that great arm of his, I feel like maybe we don't see that enough. I think that's kind of part of that word that we refer to, timid. I think just being able to just see it and rip it a little bit more, and just that's what we want to see.
Yeah. Okay. Next quote. The third quote out of, I think, 4 quotes here. Quote, and this is a Big 12 defensive assistant. I don't know that they clarify whether or not this defensive assistant played Quinn Ewers last year, but he does say, I'm very curious to watch him this year. Okay. Yeah, I am too. The last 2 years, he had superstars around him. There's some, oh my God, throws on film that he made against Alabama, but he was just so inconsistent. I think he's about average athletically. Your reaction to that?
I honestly, that one I didn't see a whole ton of problems with. I think the whole superstars around him thing, I think maybe that's a little bit overblown, because like I think they fed off each other well. Like I think Xavier Worthy doesn't have the year he had without a guy with Quinn Ewers' skill set being able to get the ball out on time and all those types of things. Same with Adonai Mitchell. So I think him being able to execute the offense, I think that's kind of getting, underrated a little bit by these coaches, in my opinion. I think he gets the ball out on time and on target. And that's, that's a lot of what we talked about with like Bo Nix a little bit as well. And I mean, that's a valuable thing in the NFL.
Yeah, I think, look, there's absolutely some, oh my God. And I think probably when this coach refers to the word or where he says, but he's just so inconsistent, he's probably talking about like, we need to see more of that. Oh my God. We need to see more of what Quinn did against Alabama.
Right.
For most of that game, or what he was against Oklahoma State, right? Where he threw 4 touchdowns in the first half, had a 183 quarterback rating, which is elite. That's like what the guys that were in the Heisman conversation, Penix and those guys were doing. But I do think there's a misnomer out there that Quinn was just inconsistent all season. He was actually pretty consistent for what he was. Like he consistently put up, between a 155 to 165 quarterback rating, which is very good. I'd classify his 2023 as very good. Now, he did have 2 bad games, and those were the game against Washington, where he came in at a 125 quarterback rating. For context, that's like what Case McCoy and Tyron Swoops were doing as quarterbacks at Texas. Not good at all for the full season. And he did not play well against Wyoming, where Texas really struggled offensively in that game for a lot of it until the end. He had a 136 quarterback rating. But in all the other games, he was actually fairly consistent in just being somewhere in between pretty good and really good. He wasn't elite, and that's the next step for him. But I would say he was consistently pretty good to very good. And I think people just, when they say inconsistent, are probably more so referring to him being consistently great. And that's what we have to see this upcoming season. So absolutely fair. The quote about him having average athleticism, I mean, it is what it is. He's not really a
he's not really a runner or anything.
he's not really a runner. So I mean, I don't
take any problem with that.
Yeah.
Here's what I'll say to close this up, though. I think, for me personally, I don't want to ever say that I know more than like any of these coaches. So to me, there's like a possibility of like there could be stuff that we can't see in the broadcast that they're seeing on the all 22. And that's what I kind of worry about, is that maybe they are right, and maybe we're just kind of seeing what we're able to see, and maybe there's stuff that they can see on the all 22 that we just can't. But I don't want to believe that, but we'll see.
All right, scroll down to the last quote. I think there's one more in here, right there. All right. This is probably the most positive thing that was said in this short bit on Quinn Ewers, in my opinion. Quote, I do think he's come a long way from 2022. That is a fact. He has come a long way from what he was 2 years ago. But then he goes on to say, and this was a Big 12 defensive coordinator, there was too much of this is what I talked about earlier, there was too much of the Mahomes comparisons around him coming into college. He does have a good arm, but he's not anywhere near as athletic nor the playmaker that Mahomes is. Thanks for telling us that, Captain Obvious. Or has that kind of presence. Now this is the part that loses me, because he kind of just goes into the abyss here talking about other stuff. It's kind of a strange deal, because people want to talk about that, about what he was supposed to be, or they want to talk about Arch Manning behind him. But that isn't the kid's fault. So he goes from talking about how he's come a long way from 2022 to talking about how he isn't Patrick Mahomes, to talking about how he has a good arm, but he's not anywhere near Patrick Mahomes, to talking about how what people want to talk about, that he's not what he's supposed to be, or they want to talk about Arch. And that's not his fault. I do think, though, the Mahomes stuff is a little bit his fault, because whether it's fair or not, I mean, he was advertised that way coming out. Now, I will say, look, they're going to talk about Arch always, regardless of what Quinn does. Quinn could go out and win the Heisman this upcoming season. They're still going to talk about Arch Manning. I guarantee you. So that part's kind of irrelevant to me. But I think, I think this quote's fair. I just don't really know what the overall
takeaway
is. I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah,
I guess it would be that he
doesn't have a thesis. Like, he's kind of just all over the place. Yeah.
So I thought we'd bring this up just because it's interesting. And I get the sense, and maybe this isn't true, I'm just guessing, that this is maybe a defensive coordinator that, played him in 2022, saw him in 2022, and then watched him on film this past year, but didn't actually play him, because he just didn't really have a lot of insights. I feel like I could be wrong on that, but that's just the sense that I get from reading.
I can see that.
Okay, well, that's the Quinn Ewers part of it. I think a lot of it is fair, but there are some things that I would just add more context to. in some things that I think just needed a little more context. But I think overall the criticisms are the criticisms. And in order for Quinn to, I guess, not to say he hasn't had a successful run at Texas, because he won Texas a Big 12 championship. But for him to achieve what he wants to achieve ultimately, to get to his ultimate goal and to fulfill the hype that was around him coming out of high school, he needs to have a big year this year. Maybe not win the Heisman, but like be in New York, I think would be fair. Be at the presentation. There might be a guy who beats you out and has a crazy year. It might be Carson Beck. It might be Jalen Milroe, who has another dimension to his game. You know, it could be any of these other guys. Could be even Cam Ward at Miami. I'm telling you, the more I think about it, I think that guy's gonna have a monster year.
Yeah,
We're gonna save that article though, because we're gonna talk about some of the other quarterbacks in a future dit hole and the quotes that were around them. But we'll get to that. Anything else on Quinn before we move on?
Yeah, I think there's just all the evidence points to him taking another step forward. Like there's no reason to believe he's going to plateau. I don't think last year is going to be who he is as a quarterback moving forward, and that's the exciting part. I mean, that's what you have to bet on, and whether that means he's a Heisman or not, I think ultimately, I think there's maybe like a body language element to it as well. Like I think these teams want to see him be a bit more of a vocal leader as well, and we already know like he's a great guy from what we've heard and leads by example and that kind of stuff. But he's also a little bit, he's not as vocal as some other guys would be. So that could be something as well that coaches shy away from.
Yeah, I wanted to real fast look at what Michael Penix did last year at Washington, because I just want to ask you a quick buy or sell question that I have in my mind off the top of my head. Okay, so Penix last year had an insane season, obviously. He threw for goodness, how many games did he play? So he played in 15 games. And the thing is, like, if Texas has the season that it wants to this upcoming year, they're going to play 12 regular season games, obviously. If they really have the season they want to, they'll play in Atlanta in the SEC championship game. That's 13. And then you're going to play 3 playoff games. So you're going to be playing 16 games if you get to the national championship. And so that even teams could be playing 16, 17 games. I mean, we're getting to the point like the length of an NFL season here. Yeah. And that could raise the stats, some of the numbers, some of the volume for some of these quarterbacks and stats at other positions. But Penix in 15 games last year completed 65% of his passes. He threw for about 5,000 yards, 4,900 to be exact, so almost 5,000. Threw for 36 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, and had a 157 quarterback rating, which is very good. I think it was above Quinn. But if I said to you, say Texas, say they play in the regular season, they go 10-2, 11-1, just theoretically, they get to the SEC championship game, so they've played 13 games, and then say they win, their first playoff game, and then whatever happens from there happens. So say they play 14 games. If I said to you, Quinn has close to 4,000 yards passing. I'm not exactly sure what he had last year. I'll go ahead and double check that. But let's say he has let's just set the bar over 3,500 yards passing. Let's say around a 70% completion percentage, around what he did last year, maybe a little better. Let's say he throws for 35 or more touchdowns. And let's say he keeps his interceptions to a minimum. Let's say he's right around where he's been, so 6 or less interceptions. Would you buy that stat line from Quinn going into next year?
Okay, so 3,500 yards, 6-ish interceptions, and then the touchdowns.
35 or more touchdowns, 6 or less interceptions, over 3,500 yards, and let's say like between a 68 and 71% completion percentage. Do you think that would be the kind of season that people are hoping he would have, or do you think it needs to be even better than that?
Well, I think
Because
it'll be
last
more.
year,
I think I'll buy that as being, I think, what people want, but I think it'll be more about the film than the stats. I think, if he goes out and gets 75% completion percentage, but it's a lot of short throws, then there's a difference between that and him, being a little bit more aggressive down those intermediate parts of the field, 10 to 25 yards and getting, maybe like 66% completion percentage, So it'll be more about the film to me, but I definitely think those numbers would suffice for sure.
Okay, so we talked about Quinn. That was a great conversation. Let's go ahead and switch gears here. I want to get into some recruiting conversation, and I hope that you'll find this, number one, exciting, and number two, interesting. What Texas is getting ready to, I think, do for the 2025 class at the wide receiver position could rival its best wide receiver class in school history.
Yeah.
I seriously think that. I think it could be comparable to the 2000 recruiting class with Roy Williams, BJ Johnson, and Sloan Thomas. So I wanted to start with the big story of the week, which is DeCorian Moore, who, according to Rivals.com, is the number one player overall in the state of Texas. He's what Colin Simmons was in last year's recruiting class. He's a 5-star wide receiver out of Duncanville High School, the number one prospect in my mind in the state of Texas. I'll throw up some film here in a minute. He's an absolute specimen. If you had to ask me, what is DeCorian Moore's superpower? It's his speed and his run after catch ability. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what Odell Beckham Jr. was early on in his career. Some of the best run after catch guys. He's got elite track speed, but it's the kind of speed that translates to football. And he does everything else what you want a wide receiver to do. He does it. He's just a very overall well-rounded player. And there are people in the industry that said if we could rank a player, a 6-star player, we would rank DeCorian Moore a 6-star player.
Oh, wow.
And so he's been committed to LSU he committed to LSU right around the time that Colin Simmons committed to Texas. But of course, DeCorian Moore is a class behind Colin Simmons. And, for the longest time, he had been projected to end up at Texas. And he still was even after he decommitted or committed to LSU. So last Thursday night, out of the middle of nowhere, he decommits from LSU. And the interesting thing about that that I find fascinating and people throughout the industry find fascinating is usually like when a player commits early on in the process, like over a year before signing day, because he committed around August of last year, and signing day for him is not till this December. So it would have been, I don't know, some 15 months before he actually puts pen to paper on his national letter of intent and has to sign at a school, right? And enroll at a school. Usually when they decommit right before official visit season, which by the way starts like this weekend, which is why I say recruiting is really heating up. These official visits are what really matters at the end of the day. Usually when they decommit from a school, that school still remains in the running. That school still gets a look for maybe possibly a recommitment. They at least get a visit. But DeCorian Moore, he decommitted from LSU, and I always thought this was going to come down to Texas or LSU. That's what I've always thought. There have been other schools in the running, which we'll mention, but I thought it was always a Texas LSU battle, and that's kind of the sense that people have gotten from DeCorian Moore and his family speaking to DeCorian Moore. However, a couple of days after, his decommitment, he goes on Twitter and he says, "I'm not reopening my commitment." And he lists out the official visits that he's going to take. And so it's these schools that are in the running and nobody else. He basically said, these other schools, lose my number. It's going to be one of these three. And so I don't know what happened with LSU that they're out of the running. It could be a multitude of things, right? I mean, right now LSU has the best quarterback in the 2025 class committed to them. They have the first or second best running back. It's arguable at the end of the day, but they have a really elite running back signed to them or committed to them right now. They have a really good class going, and it was even better with Moore. But without Moore, it kind of brings it down a little bit. And now there's speculation about the quarterback that's committed to them, whether or not he'll remain in the class. That's too much about LSU, though. His official visits, he's going to visit Ohio State this weekend, I believe. Then he's going to visit Texas the weekend of June 14th. So take a week off after Ohio State. He'll visit Texas June 14th. And then the next weekend, he's planning to visit Oregon. And those are the three schools that he's going to be visiting. And I expect that he'd make a decision shortly after that, because a lot of these elite prospects, they want to have their decision. They want to know where they're going to school before their high school season starts, before their senior season starts, so they can focus on football. And they don't have to worry about anything else. Recruiting, going on visits during the season, everything else, right? Most of these elite guys want to get that out of the way. And that's what you saw with Colin Simmons last year. He committed to Texas, and then you really didn't hear anything else about his recruitment after that. It was he committed in August, and then he played his season, and then in December he signed with Texas, and that was that. That's what I think Texas is hoping for with DeCorian Moore. Now, do you have any questions on that part of it? I just needed to set the scene for our audience.
Yeah.
What the situation is. Do you have any questions on DeCorian Moore and his recruitment?
Well, for me, I had heard his name come up. I think we did a 2025 class episode like really early on, like right after the season. You had mentioned his name. And at that point he was still at LSU, but you had even said back then that like Texas is still going after this kid. So, yeah. I mean, credit to you, man. I mean, that's like, if Texas gets him and Jamie French, who we're going to talk about, I just read up on Jamie French before the episode as well. Like, holy crap, dude. Like, I don't really know how to, like, what to compare it to, like you do, because I'm like still so new to recruiting. But man, like, having the competition in the building, like kind of having it to where these guys are just going to come in and fight for their spots, man. That's how you want it.
Yeah, I'm working on pulling up some highlights on Decory Moore, but I wanted to kind of set the scene on what these official visits mean and where I think Decory Moore is going to end up. So when we think about Ohio State, what do you think about when you think about Ohio State? Well, they have Brian Hartline, who's the wide receivers coach,
Right.
who's known for putting a pipeline of wide receivers into the NFL, developing really elite receivers and putting them into the NFL. You think about, you can run down the list. We could be here all day talking about the Ohio State wide receivers that have gone to the NFL just the past 5 years, right? I mean, you think about Jackson Smith and Jigba, you think about Marvin Harrison, you think about,
Garrett Wilson,
all those guys, right? And those guys are going to be legitimate starters, stars, Pro Bowlers in the NFL. They're not just putting receivers in the NFL, but the guys that they're putting in the NFL are starters in the league.
Yeah.
And they're first, second round picks. And that's really, playing in that offense. Ohio State having a little bit more of a track record of consistent winning over the years. That's basically going to be Ohio State's pitch to Decory Moore. And they also probably have a pretty nice NIL package that they can put together for him as well. Texas, what is their case? Well, he's close to home. He gets to play in the SEC, the premier conference in college football, which for the large part in the past 2 decades continues to put the most players into the NFL year after year. He gets to play against the highest level of competition along with the Big Ten, but I think a lot of people consider the Southeast to be the highest level of competition in college football. He gets to go play at these massive games, right? He gets to go play at LSU. He'll get to go play Texas A&M. He'll get to go play Alabama, Georgia, teams that have largely been dominating college football, the latter two mainly, Alabama and Georgia, over the past decade or so. Gets to play for Sark, who's considered one of the offensive masterminds in college football. He's up there with Ryan Day and a lot of others, right? Lincoln Riley. And potentially, the quarterback also plays a big part in this. His quarterback will be Arch freaking Manning. And I think that weighs its, fair share weight in gold, if you will. I don't even know if I said that correctly. That's worth its weight in gold is the correct way to say that. And then what Ohio State, there's not much you can negatively recruit Texas on anymore, because the last thing you could negatively recruit Texas on was, they're pitching to you a vision, but they've still yet to accomplish that vision. They've yet to actually win on the field. They've yet to actually do the football part. Yes, they can give you the NIL money. They can give you the shiny car. They can give you they can get you excited about what potentially could happen, but you haven't seen it on the field yet. And now that Texas has won a conference championship, they've won 12 games in a season, they've been to the college football playoff semifinal, you can't really say that anymore. So there's not a whole lot to negatively recruit Texas on anymore. But what they could say, if you're Ohio State, is, well, they haven't been putting receivers into the league like we have been. Yes, sure, they did it this past year with Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy, who went in rounds 1 and 2. But where has the rest been? What I think Texas would say to that is, well, watch what Sark has done, in his other stops with wide receivers. Look what he did with those Alabama wide receivers, where those guys end up by playing in his offense. you know, with an NFL quarterback, Mac Jones, and Tua for that matter. You know, look what he did in his stops in the NFL or at USC, whatever, before he got himself into a little bit of trouble. So I do think Texas to kind of, and then he's going to go visit Oregon, and Oregon kind of has the same thing, but I think they're at a disadvantage given that, you know, they're in the Pacific Northwest, and that they I think more so than Ohio State have the NIL money to kind of actually actually compete or beat out even Texas, because they have all that Phil Knight Nike money that we're talking about. But I just think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is DeCoria Moore has visited Texas countless times. He was actually on campus, I think, 2 or 3 weeks in the month of April, where he started to kind of consider decommitting from LSU. He's got a great relationship with Sark. He's got a wide receivers coach that has coached in the NFL, and Chris Jackson, that he has a great relationship with. He has former teammates on the team already, connections with Texas. He's friends with Arch Manning. He knows the quarterbacks. He loves Sark. They have the NIL deal. It's close to home. I just think at the end of the day, all signs are pointing to DeCoria Moore ending up at Texas at the end of the day. And it would be similar, I think, to Arch Manning committing to Texas. I think the ripple effect of DeCoria Moore committing to Texas would have a similar ripple effect to Arch Manning, because he's that good of a player.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's arguably the best player in the nation. I mean, he's going to come in and, I mean, given the amount of hype that Ryan Wingo has gotten just from, you know, the spring game and everything else, like with DeCoria Moore, you could double that. I mean, and then plus, you know, whatever we're going to have with Arch Manning coming into the starting job, like that's going to be pandemonium if it happens.
Yeah, and that's not where it stops. DeCoria Moore is not where it's going to stop for Texas at the wide receiver position in 2023. This class is loaded, especially in state, but similar to what they did last year, where Sark pulled a rabbit out of the hat after he missed out on Micah Hudson, who was the top receiver in the state of Texas in the 2024 class, who actually ended up at Texas Tech, believe it or not. I think he's the first 5-star that Texas Tech has ever signed. Sark quickly pivoted to Ryan Wingo. And, you know, at this time last year, Texas wasn't really in the mix for Ryan Wingo. I mean, they had talked to him. They had been recruiting him. But it felt like at that moment in time, with, you know, all the NIL money that Missouri could offer and wanting to play in the SEC for the home school, stay close to home, that he was going to be a Missouri Tiger. And it felt that way for the longest period of time, up until Texas lost out on Micah Hudson, at which point Sark and the coaching staff quickly pivoted to Ryan Wingo. They got him on campus, and he ended up committing to Texas in October. And it was a fight to the end to keep that commitment, because Missouri was still pushing for him. There were some other schools that wanted to get in on the Ryan Wingo sweepstakes, but Texas ended up getting him to sign on the dotted line. And that was big, because that was a 5-star, legitimate, super blue chip wide receiver prospect from out of state that kind of salvaged last year's wide receiver class. So I think what they're possibly going to try to do here with Jamie French is going to be similar to that. He's going to end up a 5-star. Right now, according to Rivals.com, he's borderline, but they haven't given out all their 5 stars yet. They gradually roll out their 5 stars, throughout the year. He is, though, a 5-star according to 24/7 Sports and according to the 24/7 Sports composite rankings, which takes into account everything. He's a 6'1", about 185, 190 pound receiver out of Jacksonville, Florida, at Mandarin High School. Very good player. His highlights are electric. I don't know, what you've maybe watched of him or what you've seen of him yet, but he's a very good player. And just, I think it was a week or two ago, he came out and said directly, like, after his first visit to Texas, and I should put some context to this, he was originally an Alabama commit, but he decommitted when Saban retired. And so, he's got other schools in the mix. I think LSU is going to be in play here, especially since now they've lost out on Decorian Moore. I think Ohio State will absolutely make a push for him. He's one of the more elite wide receiver prospects nationally. There are other schools that will try to get in the mix. But at the end of the day, he came out and said, the relationships I have at Texas with Sark, with Chris Jackson, with some of the other receiver prospects that Texas is recruiting to be in this class, including Decorian Moore, I think those guys want to end up playing together. I think if Decorian Moore maybe would have ended up staying at LSU, it may have made it harder on Texas to get French because those guys do want to potentially play together. And those guys have seen what kind of factory LSU is themselves at the wide receiver position. Miami's also going after him heavily, considering he's a Florida kid, and that's really the in-state school that's pursuing him heavily and is thickly in his recruitment. But he came out and said, like, Texas is my leader right now. And if he had to rank them, it would be Texas, LSU, and Miami in that order. That's exactly what he said, with Ohio State and Tennessee kind of on the outside looking in right now, but still potentially in play. So I think he's got more to his recruitment potentially than Decorian Moore does, because at this point, it's pretty much industry-wide that he's going to visit Ohio State, he's going to visit Oregon, but Decorian Moore ultimately, as long as nothing goes drastically wrong, is going to end up being a Longhorn. And I think that was destined from the start. With French, I think there's a little more suspense to it. He's going to take a visit to LSU. He's going to take a visit to Miami, and he's going to visit Texas. But I do think the potential to play together, to play with Arch Manning, to potentially be the next great wide receiver class at Texas. If I were putting in crystal balls, I don't know who else Texas is going to get in the receiver class. That's really where the interesting conversation is who's going to be the third guy in the class. Is it potentially another 5-star in Khalil Lockett? Or is it another maybe guy not necessarily in this tier of player, but in that high 4-star range, just a really good player to complement French and Moore? But I do think I'm fairly confident that both Jamie French and Decorian Moore, as 2 5-star prospects when it's all said and done, are going to end up in Texas in what I think is going to be an elite wide receiver class.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Right now, I feel way more confident about Moore, like with what everything's been happening. But French, if we can get him, man, I feel like with Sark and everything that we can offer at Texas, I feel like that would be a huge win just in terms of planting another flag in the state of Florida, man. In that Jacksonville area, I feel like that's another hotbed of talent, obviously all over Florida, but I think Jacksonville in particular is one that, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Texas has really planted a flag on in the past. So that would be a huge, huge win.
Yeah, they've started to build a pattern in Florida, but not particularly in Jacksonville. They pulled C.J. Baxter out of Florida. They've pulled some other guys out of Florida, but not particularly in that area. And one thing we've seen with Sark so far at Texas is he started to build pipelines at the schools that continue to put out elite players. We've seen him build a pipeline to Mater Dei High School in California. We've seen him build a pipeline to a lot of the schools in the DFW area. I mean, the DFW Metro, I don't know if you know this, as someone who's from Dallas and, has been in that area before. All those high schools around there, the Allen High Schools of the world, the DeSotos, the Duncanvilles,
Yeah.
Like right next to Atlanta and a couple other metro areas is like one of the hottest beds for high school football talent in the country per capita based on the number of players that they put into the NFL. And we can look at those numbers maybe in another episode. But it's yeah.
It's as
Like
good
we've
as it
seen-
gets right there for sure.
Yeah. We started to see, my point being, we started to see like them as they move into the SEC, we've started to see them build more of a pipeline to Louisiana and some of these other southeastern states. Georgia would be great if they could pull that off, but the presence of Kirby Smart in Georgia is just going to make that really difficult. And I think Texas is willing to go head to head pretty much anybody on any recruitment in the country. I think they have that capability, but I don't think Texas wants any part of Kirby Smart in Georgia in recruiting those kids that come out of the Atlanta area. I think most of those kids are going to be staying in Georgia, and rightfully so, until something changes to play for Kirby Smart. But it's harder for Texas because they have Texas A&M and some other schools that have done really well in Texas in the past. But that should be a similar mindset for Texas. Like they shouldn't let Georgia or Alabama come in and poach the elite players in the state of Texas. Those players should be reserved for the University of Texas, the flagship university in the state of Texas. Although that's not what our friend in College Station, Mr. Mike Elko, thinks.
Friend.
We're the flagship program in this state, right? And
A bullshit? A bullshit? A bullshit. A bullshit.
Yeah, it is bullshit. So yeah, I mean, I could be here all day talking about this, but I think at the end of the day, right now, as it stands, May 22nd, right before official visit season, which is in June, going into the first part of July. For Texas, the big official visit season is June. They have two big weekends, the June 14th weekend and the June 21st weekend. It's when all the elite players that they're really going after will be on campus for a couple of days, taking their official visits, talking to players, talking to coaches, getting the red carpet rolled out for them left and right, talking NIL, all that stuff. And that's where Texas will really start to push for, or have in the past, they've started to push for commitments from some of these elite guys. And I think you're going to see that. I think what I'm planning to do here, what we're going to do is we're going to address recruiting for most of the time leading into these official visits. We're going to go by position. So today we addressed receiver recruiting. In our next episode, I want to touch on maybe some other positions on the offense that are interesting, particularly The offensive line and the running back positions, I think, are really interesting. But we'll get there. We'll get to it. We'll get to all of it. But there will also be some bigger picture conversations as well, centered around the elite prospects in the state of Texas, where basically we'll just look at the list of the best players in the state, and we'll kind of handicap, or I'll handicap for you what those recruitments look like. And we can talk about some of the guys that I think, based on what I know, are going to end up in this class, in the 2025 class. That's that pretty much for recruiting. Do you have any other comments, questions on that part of it?
No. I did want to touch on the quarterbacks for a quick second though. Like,
Okay.
we touched on this on the last dit hole we did, but the two quarterbacks that we were having a look at, the kid from DeSoto and obviously the kid from Houston, they're both, high. Well, I think both of them are high 4 stars at the moment. One of them's a 5 star. I can't quite remember, but what have you heard? Had any word on that?
So KJ Lacey, the quarterback out of Saraland, Alabama, he committed pretty much almost a year ago to Texas. He was an early commit. I think he was the first commit in this class for 2025. He even committed before his junior season, which you don't see a ton of anymore. You mostly see these kids take it until before their senior seasons. That's where they'll really start to make the majority of their decisions. But he committed as Sark last July. And typically, the way Texas does it, the quarterback position, the way Sark likes to do it is he gets on these guys early. He identifies who he wants, and he doesn't miss on those guys. And so he identified KJ Lacey as a guy that the staff was really high on, and they ended up pushing for a commitment, and they got that commitment. And he's been locked into Texas ever since. He has taken some visits to the in-state schools. The two that are heavily pursuing him would be Alabama, obviously, since he's an Alabama kid, and Auburn. I won't say Auburn is the Texas A&M to Alabama that Texas A&M is to Texas. It's a little different.
Yeah,
it's a little different, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like they're the smaller school, or they're the supposed little brother. Anyways, right now KJ Lacey has one official visit set, and that's to Texas. And so until Alabama and until Auburn get into the mix here, I think KJ Lacey still plans on being in this class. Now, where it gets interesting is, and I love KJ Lacey. I go watch his tape. I think he's got room to improve. I don't think he's a 5-star quarterback right now, based on what I've seen, but I think he has the potential to potentially do something in his senior season to maybe elevate him to that status. I think he's really good, though. I think he's a super blue chip kind of guy. I think he's a high 4-star kind of quarterback, a guy that can make all the throws, which is what you need in this Sark offense. Similar to what Quinn and Arch can do, right? Quinn can make all the throws. He just doesn't. He hasn't done it consistently yet, but we know he can do it, and so can Arch. Those kind of quarterbacks with that kind of talent that can run a pro-style system like Texas does, that's the kind of quarterback that A.J. Milwee, who's the quarterback's coach, and Steve Sarkisian, who played quarterback in college and is known as kind of a quarterback whisperer with the work that he's done with quarterbacks at other places, that's what they identify, and that's what they jump on. I think with Keelan Russell,
yeah, that's the kid I was thinking of too.
I think there's more upside there because he's 6'4", he's bigger. I think he's got a bigger arm. I think he's got more of a NFL elite quarterback kind of frame. Although we've seen quarterbacks like KJ Lacey do very well in the NFL too. But I just think playing at Duncanville, being the quarterback, Texas they're evaluating him. They're playing kind of the slow game, right? Because right now he's committed to SMU, although people across the industry don't expect that to necessarily stick. We don't know when he'll maybe flip, but I expect him to take some official visits and then make a decision on whether or not he'll stick with SMU or go someplace else. I think right now, if Texas were to push for Keelan Russell, if they were to give him an offer and they were to push for his commitment, I think they would get that. And I think they will get that if that ends up being the case, because he loves Texas. He wants to play for Texas. But right now, that offer has yet to come. That doesn't mean it won't. It's still very early, guys. And Texas knows what it's doing, especially at the quarterback position.
Yeah.
But they're also trying to, balance this situation with KJ Lacey. And that's where this gets interesting. If Keelan Russell were to come to Texas, KJ Lacey says he's okay with that, but, these kids, they're 18 years old. They say a lot of shit, and a lot of it ends up not being true. So does Texas get to a point where it ends up being high enough on Keelan Russell to where they give him that offer and he ends up coming to Texas? And if he does come to Texas, the ultimate question is, does it stick as a 2-quarterback class, or does KJ Lacey jump out of the boat and go back to play for Alabama or Auburn, who are also recruiting him heavily? It remains to be seen. But if you think about after this year, Texas is only going to have 2 scholarship quarterbacks. And those guys will be Arch Manning and Trey Owens. And so they want to try to fill out the pipeline this year at the quarterback position. And they might take 2, but that if you had to ask me what's going to happen, I think that Texas gets Keelan Russell. I think they'll end up offering him maybe on his official visit to Texas. They'll probably push for that commitment. And then from there, I just don't really know what's going to happen. It's hard to say. But I think a 2-quarterback class with Keelan Russell and KJ Lacey would be very, very beneficial and good. But, yeah, it's an interesting situation because typically Texas takes 1 quarterback and they're done. But Keelan Russell's one of the fast risers at the quarterback position in this cycle. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. And what I will say is him and Keelan Russell and Decoria Moore aren't necessarily a package deal. It's not Decoria Moore goes to this school, so his quarterback, Keelan Russell, goes to that school. It's a little different than that. But, yeah, I do think it'd be great to have both in the class at the end of the day, if that answers your question.
Right. All right.
All right. We'll go ahead and wrap this up. We've had a great time talking recruiting. I hope you have as well. And we've touched on the Quinn stuff, which I thought was very fascinating. I wanted to get to baseball, but we'll get to that in a dit hole sometime else this week. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully we got you excited about the prospects of what Texas is going to do in this recruiting class, just at singularly the wide receiver position. That's not talking about anything else that they're potentially going to do in this class. I think one of our episodes is going to be an episode where we go through each position, or I go through each position, and we kind of predict, like, how can Texas get to a number one overall recruiting class? How
Mm.
can they get to what, say, Texas A&M did back in 2022? Now, we can all make fun of Texas A&M now because that class didn't end up panning out like it probably should have. And there were lots of rumors about Texas A&M promising NIL deals that didn't end up actually being fulfilled and everything else. And now we've seen, Walter Nolan, who was the Arch Manning of that class, go elsewhere. He's at Ole Miss. We've seen a lot of those guys transfer out. But how can Texas get to that number one class? Because I think that's the last step Texas potentially, could take in recruiting. They've had top 3 classes. They've had top 5 classes. They've been consistently, in the top 6 the past 3 years under Sark. Now, can they potentially beat out Georgia and some of these other schools, Ohio State for that matter, to get to the number one class? So we'll do something like that. We'll do some other fun stuff associated with recruiting. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. Still got a busy time coming up. We've got more recruiting stuff. We've got some Texas basketball news we need to talk about. We've got transfer portal stuff. We've got things going on in the NCAA that could really take up an entire episode when it's all said and done. We might do that soon. The landscape of college football is ever changing by the minute. We all know that. There's lawsuits out there. The Jaden Rashada thing is fascinating. I don't know if you've heard about that, but we'll potentially
That's
talk
the
about
Nebraska kid, right?
it's the close, but it's the he was committed to Florida, and I think promised. He says he was promised like over $13 million in NIL. And it's this big case. Now he's suing Billy Napier. You have to go read about it. It's
Okay.
I don't even know all the details, but it's maybe something we'll talk about on our next episode, along with some of this NCAA stuff, revenue sharing, and all that. They're talking about having a salary cap in college. It's getting nuts, man. It's getting nutty. But anyways, I don't want to get us down a rabbit hole. We'll have some more recruiting stuff. Who's going to be the next commitment that Texas gets? That might be the conversation we'll have next time. And then we'll have other stuff too. We still have yet to really take a full snapshot of what Texas did in the transfer portal, where we combine what they did after the season and what they've done in the spring with the defensive line and other things. So maybe we'll talk about that too.
Maybe we can do like transfer portal grades or something like that, like based on kind of what we were talking about before the transfer portal and up till now, I guess.
We're gonna do something. We're gonna start with Texas because this is supposed to be a Texas show, and then we'll branch out to some of these other schools that have had interesting things they've done in the portal, what it means for the season. And then I have some other ideas. Since Texas is going into the SEC, there have been, there's a lot of stuff. For now, though, have a good night. We'll be back hopefully tomorrow for a Major League Baseball episode, and we'll see you then. But until then, hook 'em horns. Peace out.